I've got two quick announcements before we start the show. First, if you're listening and it's not yet July 19th, 2024, you still have an opportunity to attend the global online conference SkepticalCon. I'll be appearing there, and there's a great lineup you can check out at skepticalcon.com, like the word skeptic, ALCON.com. It's a 3-day event. My thing's on Saturday, the 20th, but I'm definitely going to go to that pub thing that's the Friday, the 19th. Second announcement, we are planning out and preparing to launch our next season. I usually keep that hush-hush. Listeners are just surprised one day when the theme music's different. I've always aspired to do something a little bit more dramatic, but we focus on the show over the panache, I guess. And that brings me to the topic at hand. I am looking for my next co-host for this season. As you know from hearing Becky in the intros and a couple of longer episodes, this is an on-air role, but there is a ton of background offline research that she helps me with as well. Now, your enthusiasm and interest are great, but there's a catch here. Your interest has to deeply align with our next topic. So I guess if I want to invite people to apply for this role, I've got to tell you the next season, and the next season's tentatively called Data Skeptic Graph Theory. I wanted to call it Graphs, but no one assumes graph data structure when you say graphs. They assume charts and data visualization. No, the next season is all about the connectedness of things. Nodes and edges, graph convolutional neural networks, social networks. If you're a grad student, maybe a very ambitious undergrad, researcher, or someone working in the space of graph theory, and you'd be interested in participating in the show, you can apply to be the co-host for next season. Do that by sending an email to cohost@dataskeptic.com. Attach your resume if you've got it, but mostly tell me about yourself. Those interested should email cohost@dataskeptic.com. Welcome to another installment of Data Skeptic Animal Intelligence. Today we're focusing on communication. Becky, can you tell us the specific species and how you got onto this form of communication?
So this is about tree hoppers. And if you've never seen them, Google them. They're amazing. They look like little aliens, have really weird things that stick out of their heads. But their lifestyle is to live on trees and branches, drink sap, things like that. The mothers will take care of their babies. And instead of making sounds to communicate, they send vibrational signals through the stems to communicate with other tree hoppers and occasionally other species. I bet we can post a link to it. There's a nice BBC, some footage of a symbiosis between bees and tree hoppers. That's pretty cool that we'll talk about.
Is there an arachnid equivalent? Do people play the webs and pluck them like a piano string?
Absolutely. So spiders are kind of wonderful tap dancers, especially males that are courting females. So they do a lot of drumming and tapping. There is communication in webs to make sure, like, hey, I'm a mate, I'm not food. Or sometimes to trick the spider that's in the web, mimicking other sounds, like if you're a jumping spider, you're hunting, that kind of thing. So, absolutely, it's totally an arachnids.
So Ignacio and I also discussed another. Actually, I'm not sure it's an arachnid. A daddy longlegs is an arachnid, yes?
Yeah, they are, but they're not. People think they're spiders, and they're not. They're their own separate group, just like scorpions are, and tarantulas and spiders are. So their own special thing. They've only got one body segment. They're omnivorous, so they eat all kinds of different things. They're not just predators. The myth that they're the most venomous critter in the world, but they can't bite you, that's not true. They're not the most venomous anything. And they use a lot of chemical communication, but they also do a lot of like bouncing up and down. And I think you both talked briefly about that, but they're very funny in how they communicate. And they live in these, they can be really big social groups.
Yeah, and there's some really cool videos that'll be linked to in the show notes on Ignacio's website where they've learned some pretty interesting aspects of the, is it, I guess, locomotion? Was that the right word for the movement of the daddy longlegs?
Yeah, they are really good at losing legs. It's part of a
Yeah.
defensive strategy for them. Even though they lose a leg or two, they still locomote just fine. So if you're looking at that from a biomechanical perspective, or perhaps you want to apply something like that to robotics, like, hey, how do we keep moving if we lose a part? Apeliones slash daddy longlegs, they're a really good organism to study.
We touch on that briefly, and he had a really interesting suggestion for how we could bio-inspire some nice technology. Well, let's jump right into the interview.
My name is Ignacio Escalante Mesa. I am an assistant professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Broadly, my research explores animal behavior and biomechanics, so I'm interested in asking questions that pertain to what are animals doing out there in the field and what are the ecological and evolutionary drivers of those behaviors that we see out there. So, why animals do what they do, how they do it, the mechanistic component of them, and why they do it. What is the evolutionary trajectory that led to particular species to express those behaviors, and in the context of where they inhabit, their ecological niche and space and all those dimensions, what's the relevance of what they're doing for the given natural history. So all my work, I try to ground it in organismal biology. That is the way of understanding sort of like heuristically what an organism is doing and how it's built and so on. I also base my questions in things that are relevant for their natural history. So I spending time seeing the animals out there, seeing what they do, and sort of like understanding a little bit more of their behavior in light of where they are and sort of like the challenges and pressures they experience out there in the natural world.
Animals are big and small. Is there a particular scale you have an interest in?
Yeah, I study mostly arthropods. Most of my research focuses on arachnids. So the bulk of my work involves studying an arachnid order called Opiliones, or you might have heard of them as daddy longlegs or harvestmen, harvest fox, and a few other common names in English. So I've studied most of them. I have mostly studied those animals, and I also do research with spiders. Have done research in the past with spiders, and throughout my career, I have been involved in different projects studying different groups of spiders. And I've done some work also with insects, so tree hoppers and ant lions.
Well, I definitely want to get back to tree hoppers, but if we could stay a minute at opidiones, they're fascinating creatures to me. What is the known science, roughly speaking? I guess you can't summarize it all in a few sentences, but what do we know and what are we trying to learn?
This is a fantastic group of animals. It's an order of animals that are distributed worldwide. There's roughly about 7,000 species. Currently, there's a few groups worldwide trying to get at the describing the more of these animals. There are somehow understudied group of arthropods. They're their own order, so they're different from other orders of arachnids, including spiders, scorpions, and a few other animals. They have one body segment. Ecologically, are very unique because they're omnivorous, so they feed on many different things using many different ways of foraging. So they can hunt for live prey, they can scavenge for dead prey. But in the field, I see them frequently eating mushrooms or nectar or rotten fruit and many other sort of like plant and fungi material. We know a little bit, we know their morphology, we know some parts of their anatomy, we know not a lot about their behavior. Interestingly enough, we still don't know much about their evolutionary history, like the big breaks on where the groups of arachnids as well as the group of arthropods have occurred throughout evolutionary time are somehow unknown. So this is a very interesting group, and there's a lot of people providing very interesting novel research trying to understand big events in biodiversity, big events of in the animal tree of life, when things happen, correlating the evolution of these animals, and the big break, evolutionary speaking, between opiliones and other groups of arachnids occur approximately 400 million years ago. During that time, the configuration of the land masses on Earth were very different than they are today. So there's a very interesting literature on the biogeography of these animals that help us understand how different groups of animals have moved across different land masses. So that's roughly what we know and what we do not know.
Well, I saw in a video I believe you made where the daddy longlegs is kind of bouncing around. And you've learned different modes of its sort of motion, I guess, at different speeds. Do you think there's like an overlap here with robotics? Should roboticists be paying closer attention to work like yours?
I think they could and they have been. academically, I was trained as a tropical biologist, tropical ecologist. I got into behavior and evolutionary biology. And from my own drive of understanding what animals are out there doing, I basically, as a scientist, just want to maximize the time that I'm like interacting with an animal, seeing them and seeing all the crazy things that they can do. So that's what led to my interest in biomechanics. So this is the study, roughly the study of how organisms move, whether, it's big animals, how whales swim in the ocean, how birds fly, and how microscopic larvae are able to swim in the ocean, all those sort of things, how animals interact with their environment using given morphology that they have. That led to, during my time doing my PhD, I interacted in a big sort of like biomechanics group that was half biologists, half engineers, and people interested in robotics. The concept of understanding sort of like, or using principles derived from nature into man-made sort of like machines and structures, biomimicry, bio-inspired design, and all these sort of like push to understand it. Long story short, yes, there's been some push on this, and a lot of my research was exploring what happens when these animals lose legs, because they do it very frequently out there, and what are the sort of kinematic and behavioral compensatory strategies that they can use to deal with this morphological damage. And people interested in robotics, this is a key questions. How do they make their machines, their robots better? How can they derive principles from nature to help machines deal better with environmental uncertainty, environmental changes in substrate, losing control of a particular body size and appendage, and those sort of things. There's a big push for rescue robots to be able to navigate in small crevices and deal with this sort of like uncertainty. So I find it tremendously interesting how we can sort of like talk between disciplines on this. And I'm trying to develop a class, classes in biomechanics between biologists and engineers are common. I want to develop one in my institution. And I've had a few collaborations with engineers and people interested in robotics that just happen to stumble on one of my papers and see like, oh, can we think about this? Those sort of like collaborations are super interesting. We learn a lot. I learn a lot. And I think this is a good moment in science in which, we have more development in data techniques, video recordings in behavior and biomechanics is getting better. So I hope we keep talking between fields to sort of like understand. And for my side, I'm interacting with biophysicists and engineers has helped me understand more of the animals that, what are the constraints that they experience? How can they navigate and exchange energy to be able to move? And like, what are sort of like the predicted theoretical capacities that different body parts can experience, and so on.
Thanks to our sponsor, the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business. Check them out at techgradcertificates.com, especially if you're ready to become a data-savvy leader. Did you know the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business is ranked a top 10 business school in the U.S. for business analytics? They offer a 100% online business analytics graduate certificate program. There's 4 courses covered: business analytics for managers, machine learning for business data preparation and visualization, and analysis of unstructured data. This graduate certificate is designed for professionals in any industry that want to become data-savvy leaders or just pivot into analytics. You can maintain a work-life balance and other commitments while going through this flexible graduate certificate program at your own pace. And that certificate can be your gateway to a Georgia Tech MBA. So if you want to stay ahead of the game and learn key strategies to extract information from the vast amounts of data generated every day in business, consider pursuing the certificate. Applications are open for the fall of 2024. Get started at techgradcertificates.com. In 2023, just 10 vulnerabilities accounted for over half of the incidents responded to by Arctic Wolf Incident Response. Wouldn't you like to know how to take them off the table and make life more difficult for cybercriminals? That's just one of the essential insights you'll find in the Arctic Wolf Labs 2024 Threats Report, authored by their elite team of security researchers, data scientists, and security development engineers, and backed by the data gained from trillions of weekly observations within thousands of unique environments. This report offers expert analysis into attack types, root causes, top vulnerabilities, TTPs, and more. Discover the attack vectors behind nearly half of all successful cybercrimes, why ransom demands climbed 20% from 2023, and find out why 2024 will be an especially volatile year for cybersecurity. I got my copy. You should get yours by going to arcticwolf.com/dataskeptic. That's arcticwolf.com/dataskeptic. Well, you could simulate an environment in a lab for sure. What's the advantage of going into the field?
Coming from tropical biology, organismal biology training, I think we can learn a lot from the lab, but we will learn way more from the field because all the things that we can control in the lab are somehow artificial for what that animal is doing, for their behavior. So all that sort of myriad of environmental sound stimuli that they're experiencing out there, that's what triggers sort of like their natural behavior and their natural sort of like responses to what's happening out there. I like to do both. So I think what gets the most robust responses in our understanding of animal behavior is when we can sort of mix and infer and record and quantify what animals are doing out there and tie that with like very control sort of like lab experiments out there. But long story short, I think we risk missing a lot of the complexity of the environmental stimuli that is causing what we see out there, how they are experiencing the world. Keeping animals in the lab requires a non-trivial investment in funding, in human resource and resources, and a lot of husbandry work and just housekeeping, understanding how to keep them happy, alive and happy, and also making sure that we have proper welfare measures and practices to make sure that not only they are alive and well, but what they are actually performing as the behaviors that we're quantifying, those are good reflections of what they would have been doing out there.
Well, I want to get into tree hoppers and ask you a few things about their communication, but maybe before we do that, can you share a few fun tree hopper facts for listeners who aren't as familiar with the species?
Well, tree hoppers is a great group of animals. They're insects. I guess the most fascinating thing is that they have substrate-borne communication. So that means that they produce vibrations in their body that get transmitted through the substrate, through a twig or a leaf or a branch. Most of the world, sensory speaking, comes from sensing vibrations, which is very interesting. They're usually associated with specific species of plants. They have very unique sort of like environments in which they live. And that has somehow resulted in the evolution of very unique, very charismatic morphologies mostly in their dorsal, in the upper parts of their body. So there has been hypothesis suggesting that they can mimic sort of like the specific substrate in which they are. They can pretend to be a little twig or a little spine on a branch or on a plant.
Is it fair to call what they do a language?
They do have very surprisingly diverse repertoire of signals, and this is somehow common across animals that use vibrations. That typically anything that is not visual or sound, we tend to think that is very non-plastic or very fixed and very like non-charismatic, very fixed. So the more we start listening about what they're doing, the more we discover that they have a wide diversity of signals, of even ways of producing sound, of ways of like manipulating in real time the type of sounds that they're producing. They have a good repertoire. They have a good, array of signals that they can use. So they use them for social interactions. They use them in group maintenance. They use them in reproduction. They have different signals that some might have very specific functions. Some other signals we still don't know what they do them. Some signals could result as a byproduct of physiological processes. As for language, I guess it's context dependent and field dependent, and people that study bioacoustics, whether it's like vibrations transmitted through the air, like sounds, bird sounds, for example, mammal sounds, versus vibrations transmitted through substrate, like many insects or even spiders and many other animals out there. They do also have this very unique ability to do it.
Well, I'm curious about what we know at least about the kinds of communication. Like I could imagine there's an alert danger is present, but probably there isn't a communication for let's all wish my brother a happy birthday.
Yeah, sort of like the level of complexity in which they experience or they communicate the stimuli or the responses that are relevant for them. We still don't know. We're still beginning to understand this. And like 10 years ago, I was hearing people exploring different animals. Oh, there's a leaf hopper in this other group of in the phylogeny. What do they produce sounds? And we have no idea. So more people started listening and more people started describing this. So it's common to see that they have the ability to produce a communication that have some level of complexity is very widespread, more than we initially think. And from there, the sort of like contexts that are appropriate or that suggest that evolving responses or evolving signals will be beneficial. Yeah, they're mostly group cohesion, alerting that there's danger, alerting that there's a potential predator, interacting with each other. A lot of these animals produce these vibrations while reproducing. So one animal will produce a signal, and for certain other groups, the animal listening will respond and they engage in these duets, so that can increase the level of complexity. But overall, yeah, we're still sort of like quantifying, describing, and understanding the implications of the importance of this type of signals across the animal kingdom.
And you have to have some data to go on to study this sort of things if we want to, I guess, build a better understanding of that communication. What's the nature of that data?
Broadly, the nature of the data is vibrations, recording vibrations, and the way we typically do it is with laser vibrometry, in which we have a laser pointed at a specific substrate. Those vibrations get translated into sound that we can hear and interpret and create experiments from there. So it's typically a lot of listening. I did a few projects studying tree hoppers here in the Wisconsin area, in the Lake Michigan, mostly on the lake, on the shore of Lake Michigan. We were just listening what animals are doing, when they do it. So it gets you to understand sort of like a little bit of the physics or the physics of sound, as well as the substrate possibilities of transmitting sound across, for example, a given plant.
Well, you could getting that laser vibrometry data. I guess you can listen and maybe train your ear essentially to kind of learn something. Are there any numerical techniques that are useful for that problem?
Yeah, so I guess the main nature of the source is just listening and transforming that into the frequency domain, and that's when you see sort of like what elements animals are producing and when. So you ask questions about two main dimensions: the timing and the frequency of those signals. So animals have the ability to sort of like modify both of those, when they produce them, what's the frequency of signals in a given unit of time, and they can also alter sort of like the frequency in which those signals are transmitted. And in fact, the frequency, both the spectral and temporal measures of their signals, is sort of like what gives the unique sort of like species specific signal. And in terms for their speciation, so modifying the frequency at which signals are produced has very important consequences for the speciation of these groups. So we know for our signals that are important for reproduction, for courtship, or mating displays, different species, even those that occur at the same place, have a somehow separated frequency components.
Well, this may be an open question. I don't know if it's established science, but do we have an indication as to whether or not the brood have to learn this language of signals or whether it's innate to them?
So whether animals learn or they are innate, that this has been a central question and has caused very interesting debates across the last, I don't know, 70 years or so. The more evidence we gather, the more it's clear that the development in the social context at which animals grow up has a strong influence in sort of like crystallizing their production of signals, the different traits of those signals, as well as what's the preferred signals that, for example, females in given species of tree hoppers would be receptive to. So animals have the ability to learn, and people working in the fields of cognitions somehow understand this a little more, way more than I do. But the ability to learn is somehow innate. That means that animals, for certain contexts, have the ability to pay attention, for example, to variations in the environment, in which environment is more important to learn versus in which others it's not, in which moments of their life it's more important to learn versus not. So there's a component, and people have been thinking and talking about this genetic determination and fully behavioral flexibility and learning, as we think about it as a continuum of somehow two extreme, in which there's a gradient in given the context, that relying more on-site learning versus having sort of like a fixed ability to respond to a particular environment is becomes more beneficial.
So if you're communicating with vibrations, you're also kind of revealing your location to anyone around who wants to sense that. Why doesn't it turn into a dinner bell for the predator?
It does. In certain systems, it does, because people are revealing, I guess animals are revealing their locations. And animals have evolved ways to sort of like dealing with this. And we have certain examples of moths and crickets. There's a lot of examples on crickets and communication, that they're communicating through vibrations in the air, not in the substrate, but nonetheless the source of vibrations can be determined somehow. So they have evolved ways of sort of like dealing with this challenge by modifying how they sing, how they produce sounds, or the activity patterns in when they are mostly do it. And there are extreme examples of these crickets in the Hawaiian Islands evolving the ability of stop producing sound because now there's a new predator there, but it's not present in another island. So animals constantly, and animals communicating constantly have to deal with these potential challenges in these sort of like balancing. I guess I'm speaking like in evolutionary time, in different sources of selection, how to deal with behaviors that allow them, that benefit them in terms of sexual selection, and but those behaviors at the same time can compromise survival, and natural selection then poses a feedback loop on those.
Well, unfortunately, I don't believe vibration communication will fossilize. How do you study things like this from an evolutionary point of view?
The comparative approach to sort of like understand the evolution of traits across the evolutionary history of a group. So we understand now, we have tools to infer which sort of like clades of tree hoppers, for example, have been around for longer versus other that seem more recent. So we can sort of connect that evolutionary history with their morphology and their structures used to produce sound, and those components. There are statistical techniques to understand, so to give weight to, for example, the diversification of signals across a clade that is present and we can record nowadays. This question reminds me of conversation I had recently about people studying biomechanics of dinosaurs, for example, of how across the evolution of dinosaurs or across the evolution of early mammals that are not currently alive. People study this with a lot of sort of like studying in the fossils, their morphology, their anatomy is, and sort of like representing or modeling how they are able to bite. For example, the evolution of the biting abilities across dinosaurs is a big field in which people are able to sort of like understand and infer from those things. Things like insects that are less likely to be fossilized, not to mention their communication abilities and variation. We have that comparative tool in which once we look at different species across a whole gradient of morphological variation, we can somehow understand or make hypotheses of how this sort of like the evolution of, say, complexity or variation in frequency modulation, things like that could have a reason.
And I know some of your research involves decision making in areas like navigation, defense, and reproduction. Coming from the AI world, we have a pretty well established way of looking at decision making. It's sort of the agent framework that an agent, I guess maybe in this case an insect, gets observations from their environment. Not always truthful, but often they're just observing and by whatever senses they have. They update their internal belief state in response to these observations, and then they select some action to take in the environment. Does that resonate with your model, or how do you think about decision making?
I have traditionally thought of decision making in similar ways. Animals are responding to the environment and acquiring specific variable information from their environments and sort of like making the decision of what to do next. So, when's the best moment to go look for prey? When is safe to move around? When is the best moment to reproduce, or in classic experiments dealing with reproduction or sexual behavior or sexual selection, is which animal is the best individual to mate with given the limited information on that. And I think the field of animal behavior and evolutionary biology has made great strides in understanding, in bringing all of that environmental complexity and understanding that animals have a very limited information of their surroundings, so the decisions that they are doing are heavily influenced by the information that they have had, or as opposed to predicting that they will do sort of like what theoretically will be the best case scenario. And this has been classic in fields like foraging theory and the economics of foraging, optimal foraging, all those sort of fields. In sexual selection fields, also how animals make decisions about who to mate are heavily influenced by not only their immediate context but also their developmental context. So experiences that they had months, years ago can have long lasting consequences. The more we understand this, the more sort of like we are able to understand the nuances of how animals make decisions out there.
To know that they could remember something from months ago seems startling to me. There's a part of me that wants to think of an insect as like very mechanical, like a wind-up toy. I guess what's your perspective on it? They don't have human language, but so somehow I feel like they're between me and the wind-up toy. But what's your perspective of it?
That's a very good point, and certainly our understanding of animal behavior, cognition, and sort of like their abilities or their agency, even that they have to make decisions of their world, has certainly been influenced by our own ways of experiencing the world. I have studied these tree hoppers that communicate using vibrations, and now I study also piliones that communicate using chemical signals. So those are two sensory modalities that we do not know anything about. We have no experience, so it's a completely different world. So long, I guess the short answer will be the more we try to think and make new data about what animals are experiencing, how they respond, the more we learn about this. The more we learn that they have like complex abilities and things like that we interpret in human as, for example, counting, or the cognition abilities to count the number of prey have been discovered in spiders. They can count how many prey they have eaten. So there's very interesting work on those. And certainly, yeah, the more we hear more news about research in arthropods and many other invertebrates, we tend to think of them as little small machines that cannot sense much of the environment, do not have, they don't have brain, they don't have cognition abilities, but turns out they do, and they have a lot of they have a big ability to respond and make decisions and make sort of like processes that are not too far from the basic cognitive and neural abilities that mammals have.
So what's next for you?
So starting this fall of 2024, I'm formally starting my lab and launching my research group here at the University of Illinois in Chicago. So in addition to like, switching from being a postdoc to being a principal investigator, sort of like supervising other scientists, which I'm very excited about. It's just continuing sort of like these projects. And the thing I keep telling people is like, now I am in this situation where I have to switch from thinking of my research project as, oh, can I do this in a summer? Can I do this by myself in 3 months? To like, okay, this is going to be a 5 people 5 year sort of like monumental project. So that's somehow like in practical terms what I'm thinking. But in terms of research, we are continuing exploring opiliones, these fantastic arachnids. We're developing local field sites here in the Chicagoland area and continuing my work in Costa Rica, where most of my previous work has occurred. So we want to keep understanding. I want to keep asking questions of how and why they aggregate with each other, but not only with each other of the same species, but also with different species. How can they do it, and what are the evolutionary implications of those things as well? I want to keep exploring their biomechanics, how they are able to deal with morphological damage to sort of like take advantage of their environment, move around in a situation where, for example, when they lose 1, 2, or 3 legs, what can they do? How can they actually mechanically solve those situations?
Could you say something about the opportunities that might exist for graduate students and perhaps postdocs as you get the lab going?
Yeah, we're hiring postdocs and grad students. We're interested in collaborating. I am very interested in collaborating with people that is also interested in understanding organisms as a whole, understanding how they move, where they are, how do they respond to their environment. So we're currently open to have those type of conversations. Develop, we have a list of projects that I know can be done, but I was academically raised to be a very sort of like independent researcher. So I want to keep fostering, helping people and trainees in their career to pursue what really sounds interesting to them, and I'll be happy to support them in ways that I can. So there's always opportunities to write up a proposal to get funding for a postdoc fellowship or a whole like NSF type of grant, or even NIH, USDA, etc. I'm open for collaborations, and I'm very grateful that along the way I've been fortunate enough to collaborate with many people that are equally motivated to do this work.
And what's the right path of communication for someone to get in touch about those opportunities?
You can reach out through, I guess, my website and my email, and anything Ignacio Escalante in the UIC. My email actually is iem@uic.edu, but I'm usually there answering emails and checking what's happening.
And is there anywhere listeners can follow you and your work online?
My research website has all the updates and try to put access to papers and other sources. So my website will be probably the best way to keep track of that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have it linked in the show notes for listeners to follow up.
Perfect.
Ignacio, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kyle. It's been great. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm excited to hear more about the podcast.